Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the BRLSI Philosophy series. And it's great to see so many people actually physically back in the room, as well as seeing so many of you online, which is great. So hopefully we're back to some form of normality, despite the fact I'm going to be talking about the end of history today. But before we get started, just a few sort of points of order. One is initially for the audience in the room. If there should be a fire alarm, which there is very unlikely it will be, but if there is, if you could make an ordered line and just walk down the stairs you came from, walk out of the front of the building, then turn right, and then at the end of the road, turn right again and congregate at the green of Chapel Row by the chapel. And then we'll take your names and we make sure that everybody's here. So that's really it in terms of the formal procedures in the building. As far as the procedure is concerned online, just to let people know, we are recording this today. So, and you cannot unmute and show your video at this point. But when it comes to the Q&A session, I shall give everybody the opportunity to show their video and ask questions online. There's three ways of asking questions online. And that is, one is just unmute, show your video and raise your hand, and I shall try and pick you out. The second way is to use the raise your hand facility in Zoom. And I'm sure most of you, after 2 years of Zooming, will have worked out how to use that. And the third way, of course, is actually using the chat facility in Zoom either. And I can pick some of the questions out that way. Right. So, but without further ado, let me just start the whole proceedings with sharing the screen. Okay. Okay, so I hope everybody can see that quite clearly. Yes, so my name is Andreas Wasmuht. I am the convener for philosophy at the BRLSI, amongst a lot of other things. And I'm very interested in rereading philosophers. So this is quite interesting. Every time I read a philosopher again, I actually take something new out of it. So it's like a continuous circle of going around and finding out new things about particular philosophers. I gave this particular talk a few years ago, or a hybrid version of this, a few years ago to the German Society. And that was actually a bilingual talk. So you can imagine I had to say everything in German and in English, which was quite an interesting experience. But this one is only in English. And this is about Hegel and the end of history. As you know, there are probably the three most difficult, complex, obtuse philosophers in the Western canon, at least, are all German. I'm German as well. I'm trying to be very clear today. So my ambition today is to clarify the complexity of one of the three philosophers, and that is Hegel. The other two are Immanuel Kant, and the other one is Martin Heidegger. And if you know, today is about Hegel, but I'm sure I'll tackle Kant. I've done that online a couple of years ago, and we'll get around to Heidegger in due course. But this picture here is a depiction of Napoleon actually riding into Jena, supposedly, after conquering Germany. So this is in 1806, 1807. And the person on the right-hand side there, with a huge manuscript under his hand, is supposed to be Hegel. And he finished the Phenomenology of Spirit, his magnum opus, in 1807. And he heard the cannons of the fighting between the French and the Germans, or the Prussians, and he had to finish the last chapter, which is total knowledge or absolute spirit, in a bit of a haste. So if you ever feel inclined to fight your way through the 800 pages, that is the Phenomenology of Spirit, you will notice that the last chapter, absolute knowledge, is rather quite short. And unfortunately, the problem with that is that normally you can go to the end of the book to see what the gist of the philosophy is. With Hegel, you have to work your way through 800 pages or come to a lecture like this today. Good. Well, let's make a start. And what I want to cover, and this is quite interesting, what you will find is Hegel always thinks about things in threes, three moments or three movements. So I'm doing the same with the agenda. We've got three things. We've got the historical context and the philosophical influences on Hegel. We then talk about Hegel's philosophy in a bit of detail, and then we talk about what impact and what his legacy has been from a philosophical but also from a world point of view. And obviously today, the sort of provocative title was The End of History, ? And that was actually a play on Francis Fukuyama's book in the 1990s, which he wrote, American sort of sociologist, political commentator, after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And so this is in the early 1990s. And I want to read this to you, and I want to see how this resonates with the current situation we're in. So I'll read it to you. Humanity has reached not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Can you hear the optimism, right? And you know, as a German myself, in the late 80s and early 90s, I was very optimistic. Reunification of Germany, Lech Wałęsa in Poland, Gorbachev, etc. It was heading in the right direction. And you know, if you ask me, you know, best part of 30 years on, that we would be back in this part of history, staring into a binary ideological opposition, I wouldn't have believed it. But there we are. So this is the context. Is there the end of history? And I want to go through that because lots of commentators believe that that is what Hegel is saying, that actually everything just builds up and progresses into an environment of absolute spirit, absolute knowledge, and that signifies the end of history. So, but let's go into the first area of the sort of historical zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, because I think that's part of what Hegel is also commenting on in his philosophy. So the kind of things that influenced him, he was born in 1770, you know, the same year as Beethoven, same year as Wordsworth, same year as Hölderlin, another German poet. And so by the time the French Revolution came around, he would have been in his 18th, 19th year. And he actually initially welcomed the French Revolution as a great development in history, away from monarchies and the abuse to a democracy of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Obviously, it didn't take long for him to change his mind about the kind of democracy that was unfolding, given the terror that ensued there. So I think, but he saw that still as a movement in history of society, from one type of society to another. The Prussian state of Friedrich III in Prussia was another big influence on him much later. So I think we come on to this a bit later on, but there's the young Hegel and there's the older Hegel. And there's the young Hegelians who followed him, who were more radical, and there's the old Hegelians who were much more conservative. So by the time he gets into the Prussian state, he becomes a professor first at the University of Heidelberg and then at Berlin. Then he seems to become slightly more conservative and a focus on the importance of the state and reasoning as a really important aspect. And that's to some extent, and you know, Marx would have accused him of that. Well, that is obvious because he became paid by the state. Yes, he was paid by the state, and therefore he was reflecting the state rather than his earlier philosophy, which was slightly more revolutionary as far as Marx is concerned. And then finally, the Industrial Revolution, a huge amount of change from feudalism to actually commerce and the free market. And Hegel read a lot about Adam Smith. So he knew his Adam Smith and the free market and the invisible hand, and therefore that was part of his upbringing as well. But then there is obviously Napoleon there at the bottom of the picture, and he signified Napoleon in his first work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, and a letter to one of his friends, Friedrich Emanuel Niethammer, as the world soul. So I'll just again read that very briefly. I saw the emperor, this world spirit, riding out of the city on reconnaissance. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual who concentrated here at a single point astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it. This extraordinary man whom it is impossible not to admire. So Hegel, even as early on as in the Phenomenology of Spirit, actually believes that history moves in time, but actually it can be moved by either world figures like Napoleon, but it could be actually moved by people who are not even aware of the fact that they are moving history, because only subsequently things change. The emancipation of slavery, for example. There's lots of examples where everyday people have made an impact that actually was the kernel for change, but not necessarily massive historical figures like Napoleon. Okay, so that's a bit of the background. And there we've got three philosophers who had an influence on Hegel, and he read quite a bit. Does anybody know the first one? Earlier. Heraclitus. So Hegel is a philosopher of change. And when we come to it, he's actually one of the first philosophers who believed of two very important aspects. One is that reality is a process rather than a state of affairs. It's an ongoing process, and that's where history unfolds itself and changes depending on the circumstances. It's not just a state of affairs, one thing follows another. And the other thing, he believes that everything is in change. So, Heraclitus famously, although reputedly probably not, actually said you cannot step into the same river twice, because by the time you stepped into the river for the second time, both you and the river have changed. The water that was there has passed on. It's a different type of environment. But also he believed, Heraclitus that is, in the relations and the unity of opposites. He didn't believe that, you can't have right and left in isolation. You can only have right in relation to left. You can only have the top of the mountain in relation to the valley. So he believed in the unity of opposites, which also came out with Hegel throughout his philosophy going forward. The next philosopher, does anybody know who he is? No, we'll skirt straight on. That's Baruch Spinoza. That was before he was excommunicated from the Jewish community and became Benedict Spinoza. But he was very interesting because he had a very different conception of God than Orthodox religion. He believed not in a defined God deity in heaven, but actually believed that God was immanent in the world and he was actually God or nature. So this is Deus sive natura. So that actually everything in the world was one. He was a monist, believed that actually nature and God were one of the same things and not separate to the world, but actually part of everything. And therefore he was a pantheist. And he also took from Spinoza the idea of rationality, because Spinoza felt that the universe was mathematically ordered. You could actually discern the universe in mathematics, and that probably goes back, as far as Spinoza is concerned, to the early pre-Socratics like Pythagoras. Okay, and then the third one, anybody? Yes, Colin is smiling because he's one of my favorite philosophers. So, and this really, I've talked about Heraclitus and talked about Spinoza, which actually Hegel actually took a lot from. But with Immanuel Kant, he was challenged. He actually felt, well, actually, does the world have to be the way that Kant presented it? And I think the biggest thing that he was confused about is that, as far as Kant was concerned, is that there is the phenomenal world that we experience, and then there is the noumenal world, or the world in itself, as it really is. And they're very separate. And we as human beings can never see the world as it is in itself, the noumenal world, only the phenomenal world. And the reason why that is because we are born with certain capacities. We have certain innate capacities that are human, a certain brain, certain sensations, certain senses that we see the world with, and we can't escape that. So we can have a representation of the world based on our capacities, but we cannot understand the underlying reality of the world in itself. And I think Hegel was saying, well, actually, why does that have to be the case? Why can't the reality that we experience and that unfolds over time actually be the reality? Why can't we be an active force in the reality of the universe? And the other thing that Hegel reacted against is that Immanuel Kant came up with some contradictions, which he called the antinomies, which are basically statements that could be either true or false. You could make a good case, a good rational argument as to whether one or the other is true. And there are four antinomies, and let's go through them very quickly. Either you believe the world is, you have free will in the world, or causality, one thing after another, all the way from the Big Bang, is already predetermined. And hard determinism is basically saying is that whatever is happening now is already predetermined. It hasn't just been predetermined that you are here tonight at 7:45, whatever it is, 7:45, because now, or even yesterday or the week before, it has been since the beginning of the universe that you were all going to be in this room at 60 feet square, and that's hard determinism. So that's causality taken to an extreme, or there's free will that we can do what we want to do, and there's nothing to stop us. The other thing is an antinomy for God. So you cannot prove the existence of God, but you can't disprove the existence of God either as a necessary being. You also have the finite versus infinite. You cannot prove either of these. You can have two good arguments for either side, that the world is finite, it had a beginning, or it's infinite, it always existed. And then finally, the absolute and the particular. You know, is the whole very different and the driving factor in the universe, or is it the individual and the particular? So these are antinomies which Kant said can't be proved or disproved, and he just left them alone. And Hegel was saying, well, actually, I don't believe that we need to have two different worlds, a phenomenal world and a noumenal world. And I also don't believe that we need to have binary oppositions all the time. And I think one of the reasons why I call the talk The End of History is that I think personally, politically, socially, economically, we are moving into a period of binary oppositions. Yes, so people always think it's one way or the other. And what Hegel is saying is actually they are not distinct. You know, free will and causality are actually one whole. They're two aspects of the same thing. So, and that comes out in the philosophy. Is that okay so far in terms of the background? Yeah? Okay, so I wanted to do something that is impossible. And I thought, should I do it? Should I not? And I thought, well, why not? So here is Hegel's philosophy, his universe in a nutshell, to paraphrase Hawkins, to paraphrase Shakespeare. Okay, so here we go. So if you bear these things in your mind for the rest of the presentation, I don't think we can go far wrong. So one is, reality is the process of perpetual change. Reality is not a state of affairs of objects and subjects. Reality is the process of change in itself. And for Hegel, it's history that changes. So what changes? And so that's change. What changes is Geist, or spirit, or mind. And we come on to what that means later on. And then the next question is, well, if it's mind that is changing, why is it changing? And the reason why mind is changing is because it is alienated from itself. And what that means is that spirit, or Geist, is finding contradictions in its being, in its evolving nature, that it needs to clarify. Things like free will and determination. Things like the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do. It's encountering these all the time. And that's alienated because it doesn't see it part of itself. It sees it as other. It's not part of itself. So that's why it's changing, because it's trying to find its true essence. How is it going to change? And that is the dialectic. Now, the dialectic goes back a long way. So I think the first reference to the dialectic probably goes to Socrates. And Socrates, as most of you know, in sort of 5th century BCE, in Athens, started breaking down the harmony that existed within Greek society, which believed in the gods and things were preordained and things happened for reasons, etc. And he started arguing with the citizens of Athens to clarify certain notions. And he was in the agora, and he was accosting people and saying with questions like, what is justice? What is progress? What is love? And then get into an argument with them, and over the question and answer session, that's the dialectic, questions forwards and backwards, and basically made them to realize that they didn't actually know as much as they thought they did, because all of a sudden they had to think about contradictions in their own thinking. So, and Hegel, many years later, actually felt that the Athenians were right to condemn Socrates to death, because he did introduce new gods to the Athenian population, which are basically the individual. And he was also corrupting the young, because he introduced new notions as find out yourself, question the existing narrative, etc. So that's the later Hegel. The earlier Hegel would have disagreed. So that's the dialectic, and we come on to that, explain that in a bit more detail. And we ultimately end up with absolute spirit or Geist, which basically means that the spirit, and we come on to defining what that means, realizes all the contradictions that it previously experienced within itself are all part of itself. And there are no further contradictions to be had. And that's the holism within Hegel. So that is the one slide that gives you the progress and the process in his philosophy. So what is meant by spirit? Some people translate it. Spirit is a difficult word, because spirit is also woo type of connotations, from the rising from the dead. He doesn't mean that. What he does mean is spirit in terms of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, in terms of how society thinks, treats, believes in things, how it actions things. And that's why spirit can sometimes be translated as mind, which is how does humanity, he does mean humanity at large, how does it think about itself and how does it progress, therefore? The other thing is about an idea. It's another way of translating it, the phenomenology of idea, because he feels that actually ideas are the driving force for change. And we come on to Marx later on, where he believes Marx is much more of a materialist, who actually believes it's the physical conditions, economic and social conditions that are important. And they start the whole thing off. Whereas actually Hegel thinks it's ideas that lead to action. It's the idea, and initially, people move the world because of ideas and beliefs. That's the starting point of the process, and it goes on. And also consciousness, so collective consciousness could be seen as spirit or the essence of spirit. So those are some of the nuances that he's playing with. But what is interesting is that actually this historical process applies to everything. So it isn't just history going from one day to another. Hegel isn't interested in that at all. It is actually a progression over time from a spirit being a individual consciousness conflicted with itself to a collective consciousness, and then developing into the absolute spirit where it sees there is no contradictions within itself anymore with reality. But it applies to everything. He applies this to society, he applies it to politics, economics, religion, nature, freedom, knowledge, art. I mean, you could go on. And the reason why he's able to do that, because he's not talking about states of affairs or facts. He's talking about how the world, how the universe unfolds itself in terms of a process. And that process of the dialectic, which we come on to next, is the way that things progress. So it has equal force in all of these different areas. And this is why Hegel probably has been the most significant philosopher, certainly since the 19th century, in terms of actually having a real impact on the world as it is. Because, out of that comes Marx, out of that comes communism, out of that comes National Socialism, out of that comes existentialism. We will cover all of that very briefly, just to give you a bit of a context. Because it's a process how the world works. as opposed to states of affairs. Now, a lot of people misunderstand Hegel, and lots of professors and academics also see Hegel as having constructed this huge system, all-encompassing system of totalitarianism. And I think that's wrong. And Hegel himself says, I have not developed a system. I have purely outlined a process, how the world moves. And that is all he's trying to do. So people think he's a systemizer. I don't think that's the case. And hopefully I can convince you by the end of this lecture. Good. Oh, somebody else needs to come in. There you go. Okay. Okay, so Geist, we're talking about that again. So we talked about the mind, idea, consciousness, and essence. It's always changing and evolving in the world. So for other philosophers, including Kant, there are certain things that are innate and permanent, like human nature and consciousness. The way we can be conscious of the world in 2000 BCE to 2000 CE doesn't change. We have the same consciousness, we've got the same capacities, we've got the same organs, etc. For Hegel, that is wrong. Even the way we are conscious as human beings changes over time. Even the way we can think about reality changes over time, because it's based on what has gone before. Yes, we are already locked into some extent of the current narrative, and also in terms of how we can explore alternatives, we're already sort of on a journey. And it's moving from the individual, which we talked about, individual consciousness, to the collective or overall collective. And it's an evolution of Zeitgeist. Now, he thinks it is progressive, and we talk about progress because, we're sitting here and we're looking at the news and we don't think we're being particularly progressive at the moment. We seem to be regressive. And I think it's very important to look at his definition of that. Basically, the spirit is all about an assimilation of difference and reconciliation of the differences within spirit. It culminates, as we talked about, the absolute spirit. And I'll talk about in a bit why the word absolute has been misinterpreted and misappropriated by both the left and the right, because that's not what Hegel meant by that. And I think as far as consciousness is concerned, consciousness being aware of its own consciousness as the nature of all reality is for him the end point of the process. It's not the end point of history, because history will go on, but the way we conduct history, once we collectively, spirit, has come to the conclusion that it is all of reality, we will approach things differently. So it doesn't mean that history's come to an end, but the way we deal with how we shape the future and see the present is going to be very different. It's going to be more encompassing than it is confrontational. Then the final thing is rationality. I think another term that Hegel uses to explain this is all the rational is real and all that is real is rational. So he equates rationality with reality. But the rationality that he's talking about is not an abstraction. So again, you ask some people, what is rationality? Well, it's an abstract concept. And when we get to this, he doesn't mean that. He means rationality is something that has been considered in the concrete, in reality. Somebody's actually thought of something in detail rather than just accepting it as true at an individual or collective level. So rationality is not abstraction, which is another important thing. Okay, so now we get to the dialectic. And he's written several books, and he's written one specifically to actually make this intelligible to people in general. So he feels this statement, which I'm going to read out, is actually his best way of communicating what the dialectic is. This is in the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in Outline. So he wrote a whole book, hundreds of pages long, just to explain his philosophy. All the other books, basically. So that's. So I want to see. So listen to this carefully and see what you think, because one of the fun things that university students do to this day is read out pages and pages of Hegel just to make the other students laugh, because it's so incomprehensible to them. So if this is good, this should be the clearest exposition of Hegel. This should be the simplest way of understanding Hegel, because this is an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation of his philosophy by himself in the most accessible book that he's produced, the encyclopedia. So I'll read it to you. The dialectic. So this is his definition of the dialectic. Every true or logical thought has three aspects. Firstly, the abstract or the comprehensible aspect, which indicates what a thing is. Secondly, its dialectical negation, which says what it is not. Thirdly, the speculative, which is concrete comprehension. A is at the same time which it is not. These three aspects do not constitute the three aspects of logic. Rather, they are moments of everything which has logical reality and truth. They are part of every philosophical concept. Every concept is rational, is an abstraction opposed to one another, and is comprehended by its unity with its opposite. This is the definition of the dialectic. So, should we stop the lecture now? Okay. So that's him. So, and that is one excerpt. Imagine having to work your way through 800 pages in the Phenomenology of Spirit on this basis, because it's mind-boggling extensive. So what I'm trying to do is trying to break it down a bit. So the first thing is the dialectic. Let me just move this out of it. Dialectic is a movement from the understanding of the abstract given. So this is the situation that it is, how we see the world, which has been given to us already, in terms of where we grow up. We have a certain narrative that we believe in, to the concrete context. So we have got the given state of affairs, which we have believed or rationalized or thought about at least to some extent, or we've just taken it wholesale. We're just taking on board wholesale that that's the way things are by the culture we live in. That's the first phase, the first movement. The second movement then is that we are faced with a concrete context, a real situation, which we need to assess in light of, compared to, in contradiction to the narrative that we've grown up with. And there may be a conflict that arises. Now, that conflict doesn't arise from outside. It's actually within the narrative and the specific context that we're now experiencing. And therefore, we need to mediate between the two. And once we've mediated and have come to a conclusion to either change our understanding of our societal narrative or to ignore it, we can then rationalize it and move forward at a different level of reality, because we've absorbed, we had to deal with the situation. That's basically one way of describing the dialectic. Does that make slightly more sense? Yes? Okay, well, I'll give you another one. And that is the progression from the given. So here's the situation. This is reality as it is. There is something that comes up. It gives us, there are opportunities that avail ourselves of, and we can choose. We need to choose some of the opportunities. We need to think about which journey to go down in terms of the opportunities and the potential we have. That's the rationalization. It needs to be rationalized in context with the current situation, and that needs to be rationalized. So that's the second one. This third one of describing the dialectic is in terms of positions. So this is to some extent also how he sees religion, Hegel. So there is original history or religion that people just accept. You know, the people of Athens, for example, they just accept, or of Greece, they accept the narrative ever since Homer, in terms of the gods and everything else, and they live their lives in harmony with that. Then there is cultures that don't just write the history down as it happens, or believe the history as it happens. They actually interpret history. And this is what historians really do. They don't just look at the history that's been written down or the scriptures that have been written down. They're doing a philology if you are a scholar of scriptures, or they're doing hermeneutics in terms of interpreting history. And then the final thing is, once you've done that, you are then ready to reconceptualize philosophically reality in a different light. Because you haven't just moved on with the existing position of reality as it was. You've analyzed it, you've interpreted it, you've got something new out of it, and you've moved on. And you need to you can't just leave it there. You actually have to do something. The final step is to rationalize it and reconceptualize it into the next situation. And then all of this gives you more knowledge, heading towards absolute knowledge, absolute spirit, by absorbing everything that has been in the past. Now, what is important is that Hegel believes that everything in history has a role to play. There's no inkling in Hegel that actually, although the past has been superseded, it didn't play a role. And I think the best way to describe that is in today's term, is standing on the shoulders of giants. All parts of the past have a role to play in terms of formulating history at any one time. Without that, the errors we make, the conjectures we make, which prove to be wrong, they still have a very important part. And we come on to that as part of the politics. Now, one interesting thing that he also talks about, and this is a bit obtuse, the owl of Minerva only takes flight at dusk. What does that mean? Well, actually, what that means is that actually philosophy, the owl of Minerva, the wise owl, only ever comes on the scene after reality and history has already happened. It only comes on board. The philosophy is only the third element of the dialectic. It's once you've had the given situation and you've interpreted it, and then you, as the philosopher, then can actually rationalize it and reconceptualize it as a new framework. So all his philosophy, according to Hegel, does is actually really make sense of the past, which again is one of the big differences that he has with Marx when we come on to Marx. Because Marx doesn't believe that philosophy is really about the past, or shouldn't be exclusive about it. It's about shaping the future. Oh. I think it's stuck. So let me stop sharing and share again. And then we need to move forward, unfortunately. So just bear with me 1 second. There we go. Hopefully that will move. Yeah. Okay. So the dialectic, again, is something that's important. The reason why I've got the yin and yang motif here, because I think that's a good description of how Hegel sees reality. And in the yin and yang, the male and the female, the positive and the negative, the passive and the active, etc. The symbol is there for a reason. That there's no such thing as absolute yin or absolute yang. There's always an element of the other in the other. So the yin, the dark, has got a bit of yang in it, the white dot. Likewise, the opposite way around, yang has got a bit of yin in it. And I think that's what Hegel is trying to do. He's saying there is no such thing as binary oppositions. So we talked about the dialectic. It's a process of constant change. It's the result of intrinsic contradictions. So these opposites aren't introduced from the outside. They're actually part of the model in the first place. And I come on to that in a second. And it's all about resolution and reconciliation between apparent opposites. Now, I don't know, most people, when they hear about Hegel, they hear about the dialectic in terms of thesis, the way things are, antithesis, the way things should be or are not, and the synthesis between the two. And Hegel never used those terms because he feels that is a adequate description of philosophy, or his philosophy, but it doesn't mean that it's one and the other and they're separate and they need to be smashed together and you meet somewhere in the middle as part of a synthesis. He believes that actually the thesis and the antithesis already are including each other. They're already one. They're just being perceived as very different and they need to be synthesized together as one. So that's the thing. I'll give you some examples. So, for example, famous one is you've got being and nothing. So, and Parmenides, another sort of pre-Socratic philosopher, he's famous that nothing can come from nothing. So there's no opportunity for nothing new. You've got Heraclitus, which we touched on, who says everything is changed. You can't even step into the same river. So from being something existing to nothing existing, the synthesis in this case, or the bringing together, is the aspect that actually both of them have an aspect or contain becoming within it. The same about the universal and the particular is synthesized in this way in the individual. The individual and the collective, the community, are synthesized, are all form part of the state. And nature, as opposed to the mental idea, are all, I guess, synthesized in the absolute spirit, which we discussed. And in Hegel, in absolute spirit, which we already discussed, nature has become conscious of itself. And it's actually an astronomer in this, I think it was in the 70s, 80s, Carl Sagan, quite famous guy. He actually said, we are one way for the universe to know itself. And that's basically, in my view, a direct rip-off of Hegel. Okay. Where are we? Okay, I'll go through some of this quickly because I think we've got the key tenets, but I think I just want to cover a few. So just look at a few of the aspects of his philosophy. You've got beliefs in a religion. So belief is an idea that through action transforms potentiality into actuality. So as far as Hegel is concerned, religion moves in time, and beliefs are always historic. And we always look to the past, even if it's only a few seconds ago, in terms of how we think about the world. And the unfolding process of religion is also a dialectical process. So there is the original philosophy, which people just take on for granted, and then you've got the philosophy that actually interprets scriptures to actually saying what is the reason behind the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, etc. And then there is the third process where you actually synthesize that into a new understanding. Now, Hegel believes that actually Christianity is the latest rendition of that. So, and he believes that actually it is a coming together of the abstract. I'll show you that. So he believes in the Trinity of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. So again, that's a dialectical thing. So the Father is the abstract understanding, which is undifferentiated. Yeah, it's just a very high level concept, the abstract. And then the Son, Jesus, becomes a immanent, concrete individual within history that actually exemplifies God. Now, I'm not going into the arguments here when Jesus became the Son of God. If you're interested in the Council of Nicaea in 324-5 CE, not in his time, but that then, the abstract of God, the immanent concrete of the Son and the sacrifice of the Son, then synthesizes in the Holy Ghost, which is Spirit. So that's how Hegel saw the movement. It doesn't mean that Christian. Again, some commentators say, well, therefore he believes that actually we've reached the end point with religion because he believes that his Christianity is the latest rendition. He doesn't say that, because he doesn't say necessarily that religion has actually in itself has become completely aware of itself and sees no contradictions. I mean, Christianity sees contradictions with other religions, etc. So Hegel doesn't think we're at the end point. He also talks about the unhappy consciousness. This is and actually, just before going to that, he's also the first philosopher to actually expound the death of God. We all believe it's Hegel in Nietzsche in gay science. It's not. Hegel. Because Hegel said God isn't an entity or a being. Because if he's a being, he would be finite. And actually, it's only us projecting God, qualities onto God, which are actually our qualities. And as far as Hegel is concerned, we are part of God. And God is part of us. So he doesn't have an abstract God that is outside the world. He has an immanent God that is in itself, humanity is part of a process. Now, one of his disciples, Andreas Ludwig Feuerbach, therefore took that to an extreme. He doesn't believe it's, God is in the world and we are part of God. He actually says we are anthropomorphizing all this goodness in God and we're projecting it onto something else. And actually, that's why we're alienating ourselves, because we come up with total goodness, total power, total benevolence, and we bestow that upon a deity, and we then are conflicted, we're alienated from ourselves because we as humans all fall short of that principle. Now that's Feuerbach. Hegel doesn't say that. Hegel says it's not a projection, but God and us, we are part of an ongoing process of self-realization. Next one, freedom. Again, so freedom, these are all interesting terms, but they cannot be interpreted the way we have done. Freedom is not sort of the liberal notion or libertarian notion of just being able to do what we like. And I think the British philosopher Isaiah Berlin actually distinguishes between freedom to, being able to do something without being, and the freedom from, not being stopped from doing something. And Hegel would say you need both aspects. You need to have there's the freedom to, but that's a very basic freedom. You need to be cognizant of the freedom from, not keeping other people by not being free. You can only be free if you will other people to be free, is what Simone Beauvoir would say a couple of hundred years later. And it actually results in a freedom in the world that has no contradictions. Okay, and the freedom is a process. It's a process of self-determination. So for Hegel, it isn't good enough just to be able to do something, because is your choice in life that you make really free, or are you being manipulated by the media, by the fashion industry? Are you choosing what you buy because you're free to buy it, or is it because you've been indoctrinated by something else? So the idea is, there's the original freedom, which is not discussed, not evaluated, not really taken to task. Then there's the freedom of having actually considered it and really understand what my own freedom is. And then the synthesis is actually taking that to the next level of actually realizing it is not just my freedom, but the freedom of others, because the others are part of me. Okay, and here total freedom is when one sees the other not as another, but as part of oneself. Okay. And I think also in terms of a society, which we come on to in a second, he has an idea that in older cultures like China with the first emperor, only one person was free, the emperor, everybody else was subjugated. Then when we get to a later stage in Athens, so 505th century BCE, some were free, and by that basically some were free were land-owning males, were free and were part of the assembly, but not everybody was free. And he feels that actually as we move into religion in the 19th century, in his case, all of them are free. And that is the Lutheran approach. This is not the Catholic approach. That's the sort of Lutheran approach of God has given us all, we're all free. Progress, this is interesting. Progress for him is a movement forward. So this is the original etymology of progress, a move forward. Now Hegel actually says it's not a move forward, it's actually understanding the past. But we have to understand the past to be able to move forward, progress. So reality is a process, it progresses through the mediation of ideas in history, through the dialectical process. It's constantly taken up. Nothing is ever lost. So the example I give, is from a political point of view, is the Colston statue. So Hegel would say the Colston statue is part of history. Right? It is part of history, and it is something that shouldn't be obliterated because it's part of history. It had a time. It had a time where society was thinking in a certain way, and we have moved on from that history. But it's not. You do not obliterate history, because history is all part of why we are where we are. Back to the standing on the shoulder of giants. Yeah. So its progress is not just historic, but it's an evolving process, and the progress is made by learning from and reconciling with the past, rather than obliterating it or replacing it. And that applies in everything. The state. I think we've covered that. I think there's the individual, there's the community, and then there is the state. And actually, some people find the state is oppressive of limiting freedom. For Hegel, the state is a necessary constituent part to enable the individual to be free in a community of people. You need to have something that brings people together, certain norms, conventions, rules that actually people buy into. Yeah, and I suppose it's the old D'Artagnan quote: "One is a reflection of all, and all are reflections of one." So there you go. He was even president of the Three Musketeers. Okay, influences on his philosophy. We're nearly there. Finished. One was gentleman there. Anybody? Someone?
Would you translate Zeitgeist for me?
Yes, it's Sittlichkeit is social ethics. Social ethics.
Thank you.
Right. First one is Kierkegaard. Soren Kierkegaard. He actually went to Berlin. I think he was even received lectures from Hegel, but he took it very badly. So he was a very religious man. He was reacting against the abstraction that he believed spirit was. Kierkegaard is the grandfather of existentialism, way before Nietzsche, way before Sartre, etc. And he believed that actually you need to concentrate on the concrete. And Hegel would say, well, I'm concentrating on the concrete, but first I need to focus on the given. Then I can focus on the concrete and the individual. But as far as Kierkegaard is concerned, that's how you start. And then you move on. And he doesn't like this dialectic either. As far as Kierkegaard is concerned, it's a matter of faith. And it's either or. And he's written one book, but 2 volumes on either or. You need to make a leap of faith. You can't just sort of synthesize your way out of history. You need to plump for one. And I'm not going to go through the leap of faith, but obviously the leap of faith is a religious movement to just accepting some of the scripture and really committing to that. And the other thing that is famous, and I think this is also consistent with Hegel, is his quote: "Life has to be lived forward, but can only be understood backwards." So the point he's making is Hegel is looking at the past and rationalizing the past, but actually they only make sense of the world by actually living it forward in reality. So that's Kierkegaard. Marx. We will talk about that again. Marx basically took everything on board from Hegel. Now, he was a young Hegelian, so the only thing he reacted against is the perceived conservatism in Hegel. He wanted the early Hegel, the one who was enamored with the French Revolution. But he used the dialectical method. He looked at history and progress of history in the same way. But he said, this is Marx, I have stood Hegel on its head. His head, because rather than leading with spirit, mind, consciousness as the mover of reality, he actually had a much more material outlook. It was actually the given situation and the struggle between classes that is actually the starting point. And there is no such thing as a easy synthesis or reconciliation. One thing has to give way for the other, full stop. And the progress, though, he sees still in the Hegelian terms of moving society to a commune. That's what communism is, a commune of like-minded people, with all the same attitudes and behavior that doesn't conflict one with the other. And then you've got the continental philosophers who he influenced. Schopenhauer was actually contemporary of Hegel. He hated Hegel with a passion. He actually called him a disgusting charlatan who basically just put words together for the sake of putting words together. And you know, German, you can put lots of words together to form one word. So he felt he was very shallow, Hegel. I personally believe, and a lot of other scholars believe, that actually Hegel's philosophy is very, very deep. Very deep. And with Schopenhauer, it was probably a personal thing because he was also at the University of Berlin at the same time as Hegel. He deliberately put his lectures on at the same time as Hegel. But Hegel was established by then. And basically, because he was Schopenhauer's Privatdozent, so a private lecturer, he only got money for the number of people turned up. And basically, nobody really turned up to his lectures because they were all Hegel's lectures. So it was a deliberate plunge on Schopenhauer's basis, which obviously backfired on him. And all the other philosophers, Nietzsche, Feuerbach, we talked about, Heidegger, Gadamer, Sartre, de Beauvoir, all reacted to some extent to Hegel. And the influences in history are very important. And then I draw it to a conclusion. Marx, we already talked about. Now, again, this is important. All of this has been misappropriated by people. Hegel is not responsible for any of this. He outlined a process, how reality develops as a process through time. The only thing I would accuse Hegel of, that he described what moves through time, through the dialectical method, not how or how it could be. Yes, so it's open to people to do some interpretation. But without a doubt, he was one of the most fundamental philosophers in reality, who actually made the world the way it is now. He's responsible for communism and Marx, and we talked about workers of the world unite, all you have to lose are your chains. The whole Marxism, communism is the reality we have again faced with today. He also gave rise to National Socialism, not just in terms of the Nazi period, but the whole idea of a misappropriation of the world's soul, as if one nation could be the world's soul and leading the world forward. The idea of progress in religion and politics on the right-hand side of the spectrum, creating new empires and that kind of thing. They're all things that have come out of Hegel, which are nothing to do with his core of his philosophy. And then the existentialism, which is another fight back in terms of, let's not talk about the process, let's talk about the individual, let's talk about psychology and meaning. Sartre saying existence precedes essence, whereas Hegel says there is only essence that manifests itself. Okay. Right, so the conclusions is, the reason why I've got this slide up is saying Hegel's philosophy as a process applies to everything. And that's why it has been applied by economists, sociologists, psychologists, economists. The range of application that people have looked at in terms of Hegel is amazing. And the only thing that's in the middle, which I haven't lined, everything, all of these circles are Venn diagrams. And what brings it all together in the middle is total geist. And I think I'll leave it there because I think we're just about finished. And I thank you very much and leave you with the final slide that we started with. Thank you very much. Right, I now need to give the online audience the opportunity to unmute themselves. So I just need to change the settings slightly. Okay, excellent. Well, we now come to the Q&A session. So I think I've been rambling on for 50 odd minutes, 55 minutes. So you've got about 30 minutes or so for people to ask questions. Matt is very helpfully going to wield the microphone. And as you can see, if you speak into it like this, nothing happens. If you speak into it like that, you can hear you, so please do that. I think Tipali, you have your hand up first.
Thank you. Is this okay?
Yes, fine.
Andreas, that was a very sort of interesting delving into the reality that we live in and questioning what reality is, basically, because the culture that I come from, we do that all the time. But what I wanted to explore with you really is the idea that Hegel actually brought the idea to the West of molding reality, because reality is evolution. Once you perceive the phenomenal world, you're then interpreting it into, changing it by putting an input action.
Yes.
So that's a very Western thing, because the West took that on and led to the Industrial Revolution to where the world is today,
Yeah.
It was translated into action principles. So that's a very interesting phenomenon, and I just wanted to explore that with you, because do you believe that it was Hegel who triggered off this desire, the change in the mindset, or the philosophy rather of the West, into taking action?
He was Hegel in himself wasn't action orientated as such, because
Speak closer to your microphone.
Yeah. So Hegel himself, I don't think, was focusing on action. I mean, his comment about the owl of Minerva only taking flight at dusk, which basically means that philosophy only comes on the scene to analyze and rationalize what has already happened, I suppose, is where Hegel is thinking. We need to, rather than just moving forward in history blindly, we need to interpret that and find consistencies and contradictions in our reality. I think the action part of that is actually something that subsequent philosophers have taken up. The futility of action was taken up by Schopenhauer in terms of the world as will and representation. And also then by Nietzsche in a completely different way, because Schopenhauer was quite pessimistic that, the whole world is about thriving, striving for things, and never resting, which is a sort of, very sort of in Hindu philosophy and also in Buddhism. But Nietzsche then took it much further in terms of a secular theory of action, in terms of realizing yourself, become the person you are. I think that was much more oriented. Hegel, I think, wasn't, but his sort of future generations of philosophers interpreted as this is about all shaping the future as an individual, as if I'm the captain of my ship, rather than actually me being only a partial entity that relies on the other as well. So I think Hegel now, subsequent philosophers definitely moved from the dialectic as being a sort of process of interpretation to much more action orientation.
So do you think Marx was, would you say that Marx took that principle on much further?
Oh yes, Marx is the he himself said, I stood Hegel on his head by saying, well, I don't want to really analyze the past and make sense of it, so we move forward in a different way. I want to change them. All hitherto philosophy has been there to explain the past. The point is to change it, is what Marx said. But he saw change as an abrupt thing. You need to get rid of the past to create the future, to move on to a better thought. I think Mark has got a question as well.
It seems quite an optimistic philosophy. Progress. And I wonder what...
It's not clear, can't hear.
What we're going to do now, as you alluded to. Whether the giants have receded into the earth?
So I think Hegel wouldn't see himself as a particular optimist. I think he would see himself as a realist, and that is because his definition of progress is different. His definition of progress isn't moving, everything is moving to a better stage all the time. He thinks there can be regression, and regression happens when we are uncritical of the current state of affairs, or the process that has led us reality to the historical point. So he would say about the current situation is actually we are moving into uncharted territories again, because we're not moving from the original position now in history, which is a world of conflict and binary opposition. And we're not actually taking stock of the situation to analyze it, to actually create a synthesis that takes us forward. So we need to be careful. His analysis is not that it's a linear process. And again, a lot of philosophers think it's a linear process. It's not. It's actually a more or less a fractal process where you actually go around and reinterpret. It's an ongoing process. Right. Anybody else in the room? Marie-Louise.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Thank you, Andreas. I don't know if you've been watching television, but there's that Queen. The Queen has been quoting in one of her programs Winston Churchill, and this is what she said: "The further we look back in history, the further we can look forward and interpret the future." Yes. She says that's Churchill, but I believe that could be Hegel talking about. I mean, maybe he was influenced by. Churchill was influenced by Hegel.
Well, certainly, I don't know about Churchill. Could have been. I mean, certainly looking back in history and understanding history, and I think Hegel is one of the first philosophers who really took history seriously, not as just some sort of artifact, but actually something that tells us something deep about ourselves today. And I think that's important. And I think Churchill's quote, the further back we look, the further we can look forward, I think is part of that. But I'm not sure. Rowan Williams, the ex-Archbishop of Canterbury, definitely was a Hegelian. Right.
I thought about the idea of dialectic. An ongoing dialectic, and partly that the synthesis itself became a new thesis.
Yes.
Sorry, a new antithesis.
Yes.
And so on.
Yes.
So how is that compatible with the idea of history coming to an end?
Well, because history. So there is you're absolutely right. So if you take away some of what Hegel is meaning about the dialectic and you bring it down to the sort of the essence of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, then the synthesis becomes the new thesis, but at a different level of understanding from which the next antithesis arises, and so on. So we are moving of greater understanding by having delved, as Marie-Louise just said, deeper into the past. But does this ever end? As far as Hegel is concerned, what will end is not history itself. What will end is the history of Geist, consciousness, mind, or spirit, in terms of having got to a place where it sees itself as the reality there is, and nothing extraneous to it. That's come to an end. But that doesn't mean history has come to an end, because you just look at history in a different light as you hopefully shape it going forward. You have an active part to play in it. But the process, in terms of the development of the process, may have come to an end, and we just use that full realization or enlightenment to operate differently the way we create the history going forward. Before we come back to you, Deepa, I just want to see whether anybody else has got a question. I've also got a few. There's a gentleman at the back there. And then we also need to go online. You can all...
I just want to respond to this particular idea.
Okay, well, if you want, let the gentleman go first, and then you can respond. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I just have the observation that is history not being sort of obliterated and is unknown to us now? So we have the problem that we cannot react anymore to things in the past because they have gone and they're unknown to us. In fact, there are too many for us to comprehend.
Yes, so that in itself is an interesting observation. And how far can even we in today's information age go back in history to really not just have the dates and facts and figures, but also understand the context in which history unfolded and the mentality and the zeitgeist it gave rise to. Very difficult. But I think what Hegel would say is potentially all of the past is still reflected in the present. We are where we are because of what happened in the past. And by really analyzing where we are now and how we got there potentially, you don't need to go all the way back. You need to focus on really looking at where you are now, the given, the thesis, and then saying as well, but don't assume that everything else has been jettisoned on the way. But actually, the reason why we're here is because lots of other things have happened, and they've happened for reasons which may be unbeknown to us, but we are here now, and they're culminating in the recent past or the present to be, let's call it that way, and we need to move forward from that. But if we don't do that critically in terms of assessing why we have the society we do, and is it the society that takes us to the next step productively or progressively, then we're failing. And we're failing because we will just carry on doing what we have been doing. And I think the old adage goes, if you always do what you always done, you always get what you always got. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, back to Dipali then, and then we go.
Just to reflect on whether we have come to the end of, what shall I say, time. I think my interpretation of Hegel's what he said was that as you develop consciousness, as you look into history, you become conscious, and consciousness leads you to a point where you have understood the unity with the whole of spirit. And, the present is a compendium, is a compilation, is a complex of everything that has gone in the past and built up. So it's like matter building up, it becomes more complex. So today, the life, what we are seeing today, is a compound of everything that has happened from the beginning until now. And as we become conscious, and the consciousness takes us to the point that we are unified with the origin of the universe, origin of existence, and that is what we call in our society, the one I come from, nirvana. Because you've reached a state of consciousness which tells you that everything you've done has taken you to the point where you started from, which is the spirit, the zeitgeist. The Geist. And when you unify yourself with that, that's the end of everything. You've reached nirvana. You don't need to come back and do more to add to the progress of matter.
Okay, so I think that's a good analogy, and I think that's clearly in Hindu philosophy as well, and the oneness of Brahman and Atman, but also the nirvana concept is very interesting because when the historical Buddha became enlightened and reached nirvana in that way, he didn't disappear. That wasn't it. It wasn't the end of history. He then actually came to spread his knowledge of reality with his disciples, etc., for it to spread then. So it's not the end of history. The history will continue.
The end of the thinking, your thought. You reached the ultimate ultimate knowledge that you are part of the zeitgeist.
Absolutely. Good. Okay, thank you, Dipali. Anybody else in the room? I think Duncan has got his hand up online. Do you want to ask your question, Duncan? I'll see whether I can make you audible.
Yeah, I'm really concerned about what
you're still on.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay. Sorry. Oh.
We can't hear you.
You can't hear me, and there's something wrong with the sound then.
No.
Hang on just a second. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I've turned the volume up.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll read it out for you, Duncan.
Yes, please. Yeah.
For Hegel, consciousness is the self-activation universal, Lesser Logic, page 72, which means ordinary reality must be reconceptualized to be understood. Yet how does the self make sense of reality if it has not, let me just scroll down, not understood in the first place? Which means ordinary reality must be reconceptualized to be understood. Yet how does the self make sense of reality if it has not understood it in the first place? Well, I suppose you can't, if you don't have a stance to the world you live in and the circumstances in which you live and all the beliefs you hold, it is very difficult to reconceptualize things, because you're effectively in the original state. You are in the critical stage, and you haven't moved on from a dialectic to the next stage, which is the concrete and potentially the contradictory stage, to actually be faced with that. So, in evolutionary terms, for example, I know Hegel doesn't talk about animals, but if animals have a certain niche over the last few 100 million years and haven't had the need to adapt, then they are still living in the original state. Whereas other creatures are only here because they were able to adapt. And the adaptation is obviously mostly a passive thing, but in the human form can become an active reconceptualization. I'm not sure whether that helps, Duncan, but...
can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Audio sorted for next time. Thank you.
Still can't hear me.
Okay, what else have we got online? Joe asks, must Hegelian thinking inevitably lead to authoritarianism? No, it doesn't, because the unfortunate term is absolute. So that is the problem. Using the word absolute or final reality or words like that are the problem, because they've been misappropriated by both sides of the political spectrum. And by Hegel doesn't mean absolute in the way it has been construed, or totalitarian. What he means by absolute is holism, a certain wholeness. We have reached a consciousness of the world where we see everything as part of ourselves, as a wholeness, and therefore the way we treat others is like the golden rule, like how we would want to be treated ourselves, that kind of thing. That's where he's heading with wholeness, and he sees wholeness arising from pluralism. There's lots of pluralistic things happening in the world from an economic, social perspective, etc. It is not something that he believed is a totality, end point, end of story. We've reached the end of history. That's not where he was coming from. And I think if he had used the word of his dialectic, coming to a conclusion in seeing things on the whole, as a whole, but made up of constituent parts, let's call it that, then that would be the right approach. And that's the last slide I showed, last but one slide, all these different aspects, economic, social, etc., with spirit in the middle, all these things forming aspects of spirit. So thank you, Joe, for that. I hope that answered the question.
Can you hear me now?
Bob? Please repeat the questions from the audience. That was a while ago. So apologize, Bob. What else have we got? Stuart? Yes, Hegel was not critical of the Prussian monarchical system of his time. So Hegel thought that Prussia was not the end state, but he thought it was a good state. And he also felt, but he didn't feel that Prussia in itself was a good, just an example. He actually cited several nations as being exemplars of where we were heading or could be heading. And the countries were Denmark. So despite the fact that Kierkegaard, who was Danish, criticized him for his secular attitude, he thought Denmark was very along the right lines. He believed that Britain, in particular, was on the right lines. The idea of a constitutional monarchy is a good thing. The separation of powers is a good thing, but I don't think he ever. And in the philosophy of right, he probably comes closest to saying a constitutional monarchy is a good place to be heading for. But he never actually says this is the end point. So it's not just Prussia in his time, because that was a constitutional monarchy by that time as well. And as I had said at the beginning, Hegel in later life, being a professor at the University of Berlin, was paid by the state. Right? Whereas before, when he saw Napoleon on his horseback as the world soul, he was a much younger individual and slightly more revolutionary minded. So yes, Prussia is definitely the right way to head, as is Denmark and probably Sweden and Norway as well, and Britain. But it's definitely not the end point. Right, let's go forward. Yes, I'm doing the online questions now, Duncan. So I've just got to that point here.
Can you hear me now?
Online we can hear Duncan. Oh. So apologies.
I
don't know what's happened here. I've got the volume is on. So hopefully we need to fix that next time. That's another technological dialectical moment waiting to happen. And Joe says battery is about to give out. Thanks for an excellent talk. Right, so I think we're out online. So is there anybody else in the room before we draw things to a conclusion?
I can be heard
a couple of minutes
online.
If somebody's got a final question. Martin.
Just a suggestion. Thank you. Just a suggestion on the word absolute.
Yeah.
Ab means without, and solute is something dissolved.
Yeah.
So absolute means pure,
yes,
not containing a dissolved matter.
Yes.
That is the important point I wanted to make. Absolute means pure.
Yes, and pure in itself without otherness, and because otherness is part of it. And I think this is the problem. The way I think this is part of the dialectical process in the first place. We do need to go back to actually look at these terms, even simple terms like absolute, progress, individual. We need to look at that again, because these things, as far as Hegel is concerned, are not constant. All of these things change in history over time. And you need to look at the etymology of words and how they're being used now to actually make sense of it and understand how we got to where we are today.
You're referring again to the point is very important.
Yes.
And I go along with you.
Yeah, thank you. Dipali, you've got the final word today. This is your third go, so you're very lucky.
Final word. I agree entirely with Martin's definition of absolute, because absolute is where we come from and where we go when we have achieved nirvana. I just want to go into the intermediate period, which is that of matter, materialism, Karl Marx, action, principles, progress,
yes,
making things happen, molding the reality. And so Marx actually created, in the period, Marx's philosophy is sort of between the absolute that we've come from and the absolute that we're going to go to, and in between is this material development,
yes,
materialism. And I think that's where Karl Marx, came in, because he wanted to change the material world.
Yes. No, absolutely. And you're absolutely right, Dipali. And I think it's, Hegel is very consistent with a lot of the the religions from India, whether that's Buddhism or whether it's Hindu philosophy, and to some extent, Marx has made it material, and by making it material, he has gone back to binary oppositions, and he's gone back to the class struggle between one and the other, leading to something positive in the long term. Whereas Hegel would have disagreed with him. There is no such thing as one or the other. I suppose to end the whole thing, there's a sort of Japanese fuzzy logic, and it's described, there is no black, there is no white, just different shades of grey, and not 50 shades of grey. So I think we'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed it, and I shall look forward to seeing you all next time. I think this is actually the June lecture. So there won't be another June lecture in philosophy, but the next one is at the beginning of July, where Dr. Karim Ismail, associated with the University of Oxford, is going to give a talk on Wittgenstein. So I'll see you all then. All the very best.